Well, hello plant lovers, it is Matthew in Melbourne welcoming you to my channel. Thanks for finding me here in the crowded world of orchid YouTube videos. But here I try to grow cold, cool, intermediate orchids here in Melbourne, Australia without any help from greenhouses or grow lights or humidifiers, really just me and them growing outside largely these days or not at all. So if that sounds like your conditions, do hit subscribe. I post every week on a Friday, very amateur ramblings, but they might help you in your orchid journey. And today, guess what? Yes, it is. It's late spring here in Australia and it's Masdevallia time. Look, I suddenly have just a burst of flowers and I thought, let's do a little Masdi recap. Now, these are all hybrids, but there are many species and they're South American, Central and Northern South American, so Peru, etc., Venezuela around there. Many species in different parts of that neck of the woods. And some are terrestrial and some are epiphytes, most epiphytic, but some certainly do grow on the ground. But they're in that very high altitude, sort of moisty cloud forest environment. And orchids from that part of the world, but also any sort of cloudy rainforest, do tend to do quite well in Melbourne because they can take our cooler temperatures. Not so great in the hot summers, so you have to moderate your care for that. But generally, orchids from that type of environment do quite well for me. And Masdevallias are just such a thing. And they are named after Dr. Jose Masdeval, who was a 19th century Spanish physician and botanist. So well done him for having a whole genus named after him. And a very, very pretty group of flowers they are too, and relatively easy to grow when you get the few things right that they need. All right, so let's have a look at care. So I think the first misconception perhaps is that Masdevallias are low light lovers. Well, yes and no. They do like bright indirect light, but if you imagine they come from those high altitude rainforests, so there is strong sun, but plenty of cloud cover. So it's as though they're behind a net curtain the entire time, but still bright sunlight behind the net curtain. So if that makes any sense. So what you've got to kind of do is give them bright diffused light, bright indirect light, as they say in orchid circles. If you go on the too shady path, they will not flower for you. So I would say if your Masdevallias are mature and not flowering, then probably a key reason will be that they are not getting enough light. Now mine grow outside all year under cover, so they're not rained on or exposed, but they are subject to our winter minimums, which can be quite cold. So we get down to sort of 5-ish degrees centigrade. So that is the high 30s, low 40s Fahrenheit, just depends. We can get a little lower, but we don't freeze or have frosts in the inner city where I am. So not frosty, but quite cool, cold tolerant. So let's look at our friend J.N. Rentoul. Here is his volume 3, Growing Orchids, Vandas, Dendrobiums and Others. Masdevallia are others. This is a 4-volume series, fantastic series. They're still available. They were reprinted many times and you can find them secondhand online. And this has a really big chapter on Masdevallia and some very interesting thoughts. But the first one I wanted to read out is this. Although classed as epiphytes, Masdevallias have a root system which is moderately coarse and prolific and grows well in the mix usually made up for cymbidiums. So for me, my cymbidiums grow in a medium bark and I get it from an out-of-the-bag orchid mix. So a mix that you buy from a hardware store that says orchids on it, so it's not particularly specific or rarefied. And in the example of the one I get, it's a medium bark with a little more sort of granular element. So as though someone's mixed maybe 1/10 of regular potting compost with 9/10 of a medium bark and mixed it together. So it's loose and airy, but a little bit more gritty than just the bark on its own. And the root systems are quite tough. So it's interesting that Rentoul mentions this. Now, the other thing he mentions is that the leaves are quite fleshy and quite rigid. Now, as you can see, they are plants with no pseudobulbs. So can you see the leaf just emerges straight from the little rhizome at the base of the plant? So often in the case of a plant with no pseudobulbs, you think, comes from a perpetually moist environment. Yes, doesn't want to dry out, very damaging to the plant. So saying, Rentoul makes the point that the leaves are really quite fleshy and succulent, and they act as the water storing device in Masdevallia. So in fact, they are a little tougher than you think. And I must confess that I have gone periods of time when I perhaps haven't been that focused on watering my Masdevallias, and ta-da, here they all are. So interesting. I don't think, well, I have realized that you don't have to be as focused on never letting them dry out as I perhaps thought. So other types of orchids certainly do not do well if you allow them to dry out that don't have pseudobulbs, but Masdies are a little tougher. Now, the flowers emerge from the base of a new leaf, and mostly I get a flush of flowering now in spring, but I do have ones that can just decide to flower whenever they want. So it really depends, I think, on the exact conditions that you're in and the type of hybrid that you've got and what it was derived from. But this one, for example, the pink one here at the front, that multiply blooms for me, as does this white one. And in fact, as does this one. So it really depends. And I've probably got about 5 other plants that aren't in flower right now. So maybe they'll do their thing later in the year. But this is what I've got in bloom at the moment. So we might have a little look at each one. Now, this one is the yellow one, and I bought this, I think I included it in a short or a video. I bought this at a flea market. Can you believe it? The Coburg Trash and Treasure. So there you go, plant lovers. There are orchids to be had there. It wasn't in the best of condition. As you can perhaps see, some of the leaves have got sun damage, those spots. So when you see marks like this, these black spots on the leaves, it's generally too much sun or an issue with water or food. So there's something going on with your care if the leaves start to get colored like that. So brightish indirect light, yes. Direct sun, no, unless it's very early in the morning and it's very, very gentle. But I'm thrilled this one bloomed for me because I repotted it and it didn't look great. But then we've moved and the new growth is looking really fantastic. So the older leaves, which do stay for quite some time to remind you of your bad care, are still looking a bit touched, but it's certainly doing well. So I use terracotta pots. They do well in terracotta, but no matter where you are in the world, grow them in whatever way works for you. Just make sure that it's free draining. So the yellow one has no name. It was not sold as anything. Now this one, look at that. That amazing orange. There's a second bud there. And there are 2 things about this. Firstly, the name is called Supernova. Actually, it doesn't have a cultivar name. It's a cross between Supernova and Red Hot Chili. But what I'm here to show you is this bud here. You see? Gone, snapped off. Now, the only problem I have with growing these orchids outside all year is that slugs and snails love the new growths in the flower stem. So you can see perhaps in some of these there are nibbles to the leaves. So as the new growths are emerging, slugs and snails do love them. So I now have mine generally elevated to try and avoid that problem. But this one was actually on the ground and a slug got to it, or a snail, and munched its way through the stalk. So that's a problem I have. The only other problem I really have is sometimes getting a little bit of scale on them, but it's usually very noticeable and you can just rub it off before the infestation becomes too strong. Now what you can also see here on this one is that I have some old flower spikes which I should remove, because plant lovers, we are all about orchid hygiene and the beauty of our plants. So let's just snip out all of these old flower spikes. There we go. So this is a really beautiful one, and that kind of orangey fire red is quite a common colorway in cultivars, so you'll certainly find that knocking about in the traps. And Masdevallias are relatively easy to find, so you'll be able to find both the species and the hybrids wherever you are. It's not a difficult flower to find. Okay, and then this one here, there we go. Beautiful, beautiful pink. And this one is called, it's just called Impact. And there we go. Very, very pretty, pale pink, sort of stripy flowers. Gorgeous. And that too has some spent flower spikes, which we should trim off. And there's a spike that something nibbled the flower off. And there is another old flower spike. So there we are. And on this one, you can also see some of that leaf damage there, caused by insects and too much sun. But there we go. Very, very pretty, pretty flowers indeed. Next up, the white one. This is a very vigorous plant. Look at that. It's sitting in a secondary pot to stop it wobbling over, because that's the size of the actual pot it's potted in. But a really vigorous plant. And I'll come in and show you. So very rhizomy growth, which sort of creeps along the surface of the medium. And then that sort of sends up different growth points. And you can see the new leaves emerging. And then once the leaf has matured, from the little juncture at the bottom is where the flower spike comes. And as I said, generally flowers in spring, but can flower really at any time of the year. And this one is not a named cultivar, but it's a cross between Masdevallia, coccinea, Alba, snow tree, and Blanca. So 2 white forms have been crossed to make this one, which is a very, very handsome flower indeed. And then lastly at the front, look at that, beautiful magenta. Isn't that the most stunning thing? Now, it doesn't have a tag. I have a feeling it did, and I have a feeling it may have got lost in our move because a lot of things got blown over. We had terrible storm about the week after I moved in. So anyway, but this one flowers prolifically, and it always has multiple flowers whenever it blooms. So whatever it is, bless it, it's a fantastic variety because I always get multiple flower stems. And again, not tricky to grow at all. And I think you can see from here, there is a difference in size too in the leaves, depending of course upon the species ancestor it was drawn from. So some are more compact, some of the species are really quite small, others much leafier. So there's quite a big variety, but the flowers tend to look like a version of the same shape. And of course, quite similar to those Dracula orchids, which I've got one which has never flowered, but anyway, very similar shape. But Masdevallias are really lovely. Now, 2 years ago, I think I made a video with Dan, who is a Sarcochilis grower, but he also grows Masdevallia, and he grows his Masdevallia with his Sarcochilis in the same spot. So that gives you an idea. Sarcochilis do like a little bit of gentle morning light and then bright indirect protection, and direct sun generally will burn and damage the leaves. So he was growing his in exactly the same shade house conditions, and they were loving life, both the Sarcochilis and the Masdevallia. He, though, does have his Masdevallia on the bottom of the floor of his shade house, where it's much cooler. Still plenty of air movement, but closer to the ground. Liable for slugs and snails, though, there, but it's a cooler, moister spot in his shade house. And then I also have a friend in Hobart in Tasmania, and his Masdevallia are mounted in his shade house, quite high, getting much brighter sun and allowed to dry out quite a bit more than I would have thought too. So it just goes to show these leaves do retain moisture and can help the plant through dry-ish periods. Not too long or too dry or too protected, but it can survive a little bit of watering neglect. Now, there isn't really an off time for Masdevallia. They can flower any time of the year, and they can put forth new growth at any time of the year. So it's one of those things, you kind of water them all year. I water them a little less in winter, obviously, just because it's cooler and the pots don't evaporate. More in summer, and on a very hot day, I do really make sure that I water them at least twice a day. So cool the place down in the morning and cool it down in the afternoon, evening too, just to keep the ambient temperature a little lower and the airborne humidity up. So they're not heat lovers, but mine, as you can see, have always generally got through our summers, which can be quite hot. It's just making sure they're not in direct sun and they're in the coolish spot, and they'll sail through it. So as they do grow all year, you can fertilize them all year. I tend to not really fertilize them in winter, though, I have to say, just because I'm not fertilizing anything else. So I'm kind of not in that rhythm. But I do, as with most things, topical application of a slow release fertilizer pellet in spring, just like an eighth of a teaspoon, not much because the plant's quite small. And then during the warmer months, I will give them a liquid application of different sorts of fertilizers. Mix it up, including tonics, which aren't a fertilizer, but something perhaps that's seaweed based or from the runoff from a worm farm, for example, which you dilute 1/8, 1/10, and give them a nice sort of botanical cocktail every now and then. But I would do that maybe every 2 or 3 waterings. So in the warmer weather, I'd be watering these maybe twice a day when it's really hot in midsummer. And then for the rest of the time, once a day in warm weather, and then in the winter, maybe once a week. Really depends on whether I'm really focused on them actually in colder weather. Now, a great place to buy these orchids, which is where quite a few of these came from, is a company in Victoria called Mount Beanack, and I'll put the link below. Now, unfortunately, Australian growers cannot ship outside of the country, so don't ask, unfortunately. But for those of you in Australia, have a look at Mount Beanack. So there we are, plant lovers. Masdevallia, a really beautiful orchid and a fantastic cool grower. So they do very well outside in my climate. If you don't freeze, then they're an outdoor orchid for you with protection. So they want the right sort of shade and protection from the elements, but they can take those cold temperatures. If you do freeze, then no, they'll need to be in a cool greenhouse to protect them from those sub-zero or sub-32 Fahrenheit temperatures or frosts. But certainly a great orchid to grow indoors as a houseplant because they're kind of going to like those indoor conditions. Not too hot, reasonably moist, reasonably well lit. So there you go. I'm loving the fact that they've all sort of come out at the same time. Often I don't. They often are quite sporadic. This one is always doing its thing, but I tend not to have a bunch of them out at the same time. So this is the first time. I'm thrilled. I think it could be because we've moved and they're all getting better light. In our old place, half the day it was really shady. So now they're getting more consistent ambient, brightish light all day. And I think it just made them go, yeah, it's spring, let's flower. About which I'm very happy. And hopefully you'll be very happy next week if you subscribe and watch whatever video is coming up. Who knows what it will be, but I'm sure it'll be something orchid-based. So if you want to know, hit subscribe, follow me. I post every week on a Friday, and my amateur ramblings are just that, but I hope they help. So I'm thrilled with this Masdevallia showing, and I hope wherever you are, everything's doing very well. And I very much look forward to seeing you next week.